They say empires fall with armies, rebellions, or assassins. But the Soviet Union, the iron giant that once terrified the world, began to crumble because of something no tank could stop: a reactor core melting under the night sky. This is the story of how a single explosion in a small Ukrainian town ignited an $18 billion economic catastrophe, shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility, and set millions of people on the road to freedom. And it all began with one lie that spiraled so far out of control it dragged an empire down with it. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand why Chernobyl wasn't just a disaster. It was the moment the Soviet Union began to die. The night of April 26, 1986, was supposed to be just another shift for Alexander Voronin, a 23-year-old reactor technician at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. He wasn't a hero, not a rebel, not even politically active. He was a normal young man with a tired face, calloused hands, and a dream of saving enough money to marry the woman he loved, Katya, a school teacher in the nearby town of Pripyat. Chernobyl wasn't just his workplace, it was the heartbeat of the entire region. It was a model Soviet city, a beacon of progress. Workers lived in clean apartments. Their children attended well-funded schools, and every hallway carried posters of smiling nuclear engineers promising a brighter future for the Soviet people. The message was clear. The atom belongs to the people. The future belongs to the Soviet Union. But behind the posters and the parades, the USSR was slowly collapsing into debt. By 1986, Moscow had already drained billions of rubles trying to match America in the arms race. Factories were failing, food shortages were spreading, and the government printed money they didn't have simply to keep the illusion of strength alive. Chernobyl, ironically, was supposed to be one of the USSR's crown jewels, proof that the Soviet technological miracle was still alive and well. Yet that night, in the control room of Reactor 4, Alexander felt something he had never felt before: fear. The safety test they were ordered to run made no sense. It was dangerous, reckless. The reactor was unstable, pushed far beyond its operational limits. Warnings appeared on the control panels like angry red eyes staring back at them. Some engineers whispered that the test was being rushed because Moscow demanded results for the upcoming May Day celebrations, another propaganda victory to parade through the streets. They were gambling with a nuclear reactor for the sake of appearances. At 1:23 in the morning, the room trembled. Alexander saw the control rods jam. A blinding flash tore through the ceiling with a roar that sounded like the earth itself splitting open. The force threw him to the floor. When he opened his eyes, the roof was gone. A column of brilliant blue fire rose into the night sky, painting the darkness with a sickening beauty he would never forget. The heart of the reactor was exposed, spewing a lethal plume of radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Within minutes, firefighters from Pripyat arrived. They were young men, some only 20 years old, running toward the burning core with no protective gear. They thought it was a simple electrical fire. They didn't know they were walking into an invisible cloud of deadly radiation. Their commanders shouted orders, with a voice shaking from both duty and fear. Alexander watched them work with heroic desperation, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of flames that were silently killing them. Meanwhile, across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, millions slept peacefully as this poisonous cloud drifted silently overhead, an unseen and unfelt messenger of death. What followed was the moment that would define the fate of the USSR. The lie. The Soviet government ordered total silence, no evacuation, no warnings, no mention of radiation. They even planned a parade for children the next day in Pripyat. Knowing the streets were contaminated with levels of radiation that were off the charts, they chose to sacrifice their own people rather than admit failure. The illusion of Soviet strength was more important than human lives. But the truth was now too large to hide. 2 days later, scientists at a nuclear plant in Sweden detected the massive radiation spike and demanded answers. Moscow denied everything. They blamed it on an accident somewhere in the West. But the lie couldn't hold. The wind was carrying the evidence across Europe. Inside the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev received the real report. Chernobyl would cost the state billions they didn't have. Entire cities needed to be evacuated. Vast stretches of farmland would be unusable for centuries. And worst of all, the world now knew what the Soviet people had always suspected. Their government was built on secrecy. fear, and broken systems. For Alexander, the cost was immediate and personal. He was hospitalized within hours, his body scorched from radiation exposure. He tried to write a letter to Katya, but his hands trembled so violently the pen kept slipping from his grasp. He whispered her name, unsure if he would ever see her again. By the end of that first week, the Soviet Union had lost something far more valuable than money or territory. It lost its illusion of control. The Chernobyl disaster revealed the rot at the core of the Soviet system. It showed that the government's promises were hollow and that its power was a facade. The explosion didn't just break a reactor. It broke the trust between the people and the state. It awakened a generation to the lies they had been told their whole lives. In the years that followed, the economic fallout, combined with this profound crisis of faith, accelerated the collapse. People began to question, to speak out, to demand change. The whisper of dissent grew into a roar. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the final dissolution of the Soviet Union, all of it can be traced back to that moment when a reactor exploded and a government chose to lie. Chernobyl wasn't just an accident, it was the beginning of the end, a testament to the fact that no empire, no matter how powerful, can survive when it is built on a foundation of deceit. In the months after the explosion, the truth about Chernobyl spread through the Soviet Union like a quiet, unstoppable rebellion. It took weeks for Mikhail Gorbachev to finally address the nation. When he did, his words were a stark admission. The disaster was far worse than anything the USSR had ever faced in peacetime. But by then, it was too late. The damage wasn't just physical, it was a deep wound in the political, emotional, and economic heart of the empire. The cleanup costs spiraled almost immediately. In secret, the Soviet government allocated an amount equivalent to $18 billion. That was an astronomical figure in the 1980s, a sum dedicated to containing the burning reactor, relocating entire towns, decontaminating vast swaths of land, and providing emergency medical care. This was money the Soviet Union simply did not have. Every single ruble spent on Chernobyl was a ruble taken away from factories, farms, food supplies, and public infrastructure. The consequences were felt across the nation. Shortages grew worse. Lines for bread stretched for blocks. Mothers wept in grocery stores, staring at empty shelves, wondering how they would feed their children. On the ground in the exclusion zone, soldiers were ordered to bury contaminated topsoil in mass trenches. They didn't understand it at the time, but they were burying the Soviet economy right along with it. Amidst this national tragedy, individual stories of survival and loss played out. Alexander, the engineer we met earlier, somehow survived his time in the hospital. Though the doctors delivered a grim prognosis, he would never fully recover. When he finally saw Katya again, the sight of him broke her heart. She burst into tears. His hair was gone. His skin was pale and drawn, but his eyes still held the same warmth she had fallen in love with. They held each other in a long, silent embrace, knowing their lives and their country had been altered forever. Yet, even as ordinary citizens suffered, the state apparatus desperately tried to maintain its old lies. Officials on television claimed the crisis was under control, even as a radioactive cloud drifted silently across Europe. Thousands of cleanup workers, known as liquidators, were sent into the contaminated zone without proper protective gear, their health sacrificed for the sake of appearances. Soldiers tore down houses, slaughtered radiated livestock, and bulldozed entire villages into the earth, trying to erase the evidence of the catastrophe. This blatant deception started to raise dangerous questions among the populace. If the government had lied about this massive, undeniable disaster, what else had they lied about? The trust between the people and the state was fracturing. Gorbachev himself began to realize something much deeper. Chernobyl wasn't just a technological accident. It was a symptom of a decaying empire built on a foundation of secrecy, denial, and a system that punished anyone who dared to speak the truth. Years later, in his memoirs, he would state that Chernobyl, more than the Cold War or any other factor, was the real cause of the Soviet Union's collapse. The disaster shook the very foundation of Soviet identity. For the very first time, people from Moscow to Kazakhstan, from all corners of the vast empire, began to demand transparency. Protests, once unthinkable, started to erupt in cities. Journalists, emboldened by this new atmosphere, wrote articles that would have been banned just a year earlier. Scientists, tired of the political interference, spoke publicly about the systemic corruption and negligence that led to the meltdown. Even high-ranking party members began admitting privately that the Soviet dream was dying. And in the middle of all this historic turmoil were ordinary people like Alexander and Katya. They had given everything to a country that, in the end, could not protect them. They married quietly a year later, in a small, simple ceremony, promising to build a life together, no matter how uncertain the future seemed. Their story mirrored that of millions of Soviet families, all struggling to find their footing and rebuild in the aftermath of a national tragedy. As the Soviet Union staggered through the late 1980s, each economic blow pushed it closer to the brink. The war in Afghanistan, the falling price of oil, and the crippling cost of the Chernobyl cleanup created a perfect storm. By 1991, the empire that once terrified the West was broken. It fractured into a collection of struggling independent republics, buried under a mountain of debt and utterly exhausted by decades of lies. But from those ruins, something incredibly powerful emerged. The truth: Chernobyl forced the Soviet Union to confront its own failures on a scale it never had before. And in doing so, it gave ordinary people the courage to demand fundamental change. It lit the fuse for a revolution of minds. When the red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time on Christmas Day, 1991, Alexander watched the broadcast from his small apartment, with Katya sitting beside him. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply turned to her and whispered, "Maybe now, our children will grow up in a country that tells the truth." The explosion at Chernobyl did more than just melt a reactor core. It melted the illusion of a perfect, invincibly empire. It triggered an $18 billion collapse that exposed the deep cracks already hidden within the U.S. And in doing so, it left the world with a timeless lesson, that the greatest dangers we face are not always the ones that explode with fire and force, but the ones that are buried silently behind walls of silence. Thanks for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next one.